Okay, welcome to our standing training for flow sheet setup and using. On the agenda today, we're going to cover what is a flow sheet. Some people have never ever seen a flow sheet in EHR or used a flow sheet. So we'll go over what is a flow sheet. We'll have an overview. We'll talk about some components and getting started, some prerequisites. We'll go through building a flow sheet, utilizing a flow sheet, maintaining a flow sheet, some tips, and some questions and answers at the end. So, what is a flow sheet? So, what a flow sheet is, it's a nice, I call it a one stop shop. So, when the providers are actually seeing the patients or the nurses are talking to the patients on the phone, if we have a patient who's a diabetic, hypertension, and hyperlipidemia, I don't want to have to look at their problem list and look at their labs. I want to be able to go in one screen and be able to see what those labs are that are trending, if they've had their foot exam, if they're a smoker, what their vitals have been over time, and what medications those patients are on. So I'll be able to see that in one view depending on how you build your flow sheets. So it's nice for the providers to be able to look at that and see how the patient is doing over time. You can also create a graph and give that graph to a patient to say, oh, you're doing great, your blood pressure is coming down, your weight's coming down, and your A1C is also coming down. A little bit about flow sheet overview. So as I mentioned, it's a one-stop shop. Flow sheets are in your EHR. They have been there for a long time. People don't often use them or create them because they're not sure how to. Some people use them all the time, and that is their go-to place in EHR prior to seeing the patient. For this particular patient is a diabetic patient, so I can see what their A1C was. They're also hyperlipidemia patient, so I can see what their LDL and their HDL was. And then I can take a look at what their vitals are. And down here on the medications, these are the medications the patient is taking, which corresponds with what is happening up here, whether that medication is working, you stopped it. So again, these are in EHR, and there is a flow sheet tab at the top, and we'll go over all of these different things here, but I just kind of wanted to show you what a flow sheet actually looks like. So when we're building it, you understand when we're going through these components or what is a label, which this is a label. This is a label for the labs. This is a label for the vitals. And these are our components that we have selected to appear on the flow sheet. Now, when you go into the flow sheet setup, this is what you will see. There are flow sheets that come shipped with the system. If you do not have these flow sheets, you can open up a case with support, and we can get these flow sheets loaded for you. Here at HCN, we're going through these flow sheets currently to make sure that these flow sheets are actually the ones that they're 100% working, and take out the ones that are no longer working. So you would see some adult medicine flow sheets, some cardiology, diabetic, endocrinology, nephrology. So there's a whole list that will actually already come preloaded with the system. So you ask, what are components that I have to put on this flow sheet? When you are actually building a flow sheet, there's going to be medicine components, lab components, loin codes, vitals, medications, and problems. Those are the items that you'll be able to add to your flow sheet. So people that are not familiar with EHR or building flow sheets, they might not know what a medicine is. So a medicine code is what is used when your providers or your clinical staff is actually documenting on your patient. So when they're documenting and they're using a form, there's a medicine dictionary that sits in the back that actually codes everything that you're actually selecting. So when you're looking to put tobacco use on your form, you can actually search for tobacco use, or you can actually go and you can search for the number for tobacco use, the medicine ID. What's a lab component? Often when people are building flow sheets, they get confused between a lab test and a lab component. When you build a flow sheet, you don't put a CBC on your flow sheet. A CBC is a test. A lipid panel is a test. What they're looking for on the flow sheet is the components of that test. And you can find these in Energy under lab information. And if you pull up the test and you go to the actual component, if you go to the catalog and you go to the component, you will actually see the component name and the associated ID that is used for that component. That's going to be critical when you're actually adding labs, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but I just wanted to show you when you do build them, you're going to want to look for your component codes. Besides a component code, you could have a LOINC code. So let's say I have a lipid panel, which again is the test, but I'm looking for the LDL and the HDL out of that lipid test. I could have that lipid test done at Quest. I could have it done at LabCorp, or maybe your center has the machine that will actually result a lipid test, which then it would be resulted manually. Well, when I'm building my flow sheet, I don't want a line for an LDL that comes from Quest, a line for my LDL that comes from LabCorp, and a line for my LDL that comes from my manual lab. One, it doesn't look pretty on the flow sheet. And two, it's very difficult if one is done a couple times manually and then once at LabCorp, it's hard for the providers to actually see that clearly on the flow sheet. So what you do is you actually look for the LOINC code. And the LOINC code takes that code from LabCorp, that code from Quest, and that code from your manual in-house lab, and I'll call it, it puts it under an umbrella. So now when I get those results back, and on my flow sheet, I put that LOINC code, then it doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it's manual, manual, LabCorp, or Quest, it will appear on one line. When you're looking at your test results within EHR, so if you have a patient that has had the test done that you're looking for, that LOINC code will appear underneath those test results. And this L-2093-3 is the LOINC code for the cholesterol total. Okay? That's a good way of looking for your LOINC codes. Another thing that you can put on your flow sheet is vitals. And you can put the different components of the vitals. Maybe I don't want all of the components, but as you see marked here in red, these are the components that I can select from. And this is where it is pulling from. Again, in order to build your flow sheet, you need to know where the information is coming from. So when you're entering a vitals, you have your blood pressure, whether it's sitting, standing, supine, your pulse rate, your rhythm, your temperature, whether it's oral or another route, what the respiration height, etc. is. These are components that can be pulled into your flow sheet. Medications. Medications can be pulled into a flow sheet by either the drug code or the drug group. This is actually very nice to put on a flow sheet. So if I have a diabetic hypertensive patient, I want to be able to see just those medications that patient is taking for either their diabetes or their hypertension. Because quickly I can look at that flow sheet and say, this patient is on metformin 500 milligrams, but their A1C keeps going up and up and up. So I may have to bump that up to discontinue that one and bump it up to metformin 1,000 milligrams, and then see how that trends and see if the A1C comes down. But we'll get into this a little bit further. But when you're looking to add a medication, to add it by the code is very easy. It equals the name. But to add it by a drug group, you have to know which drug group that particular drug lives in. So that is actually an energy under setup, prescriptions, and then if you go under the drugs, you pull up the drug, say metformin, and then the group is the anti-diabetic group. So if you wanted to pull in all of the diabetic medications that are underneath that, you would just come in and find out what group they live in to be able to use it on your flow sheet. Problems. So problems can be added to your flow sheet, and they can be added to the flow sheet either using a Medicine ID or an ICD-10. Now, when you're doing your documentation and your problem is under assessment, and that provider actually adds that to the problem list, it will show you what the ICD-10 is in the outline of the encounter note, or it'll show you what the Medicine ID is. You could also go to the Problems tab, where these are pulling from, and add a diagnosis by the ICD-10 or the medicine finding. You would just, here, when they're already added, you can see what that ICD-10 code is that is associated with that problem. We have some prerequisites. So there's some users and securities, practice configuration, provider preferences, and user preferences that you're going to want to set up, especially users and securities, for people to have access to maintain these flow sheets. We don't recommend that everybody has access to maintain flow sheets. Maybe you have a team of people that are working on flow sheets and they have the proper securities. We'll go through these users and securities and practice configurations. So for the flow sheets, users, and securities, you're going to go into Energy, Setup, Practice Admin, which you have to have Practice Admin, right? So this is probably your MIS or your IT department. You'll go to Users and Securities, and then Features Contains. On the right-hand side, you're going to type in Flow. So on the securities can be set up on an individual user or on a role. We always recommend that putting securities on a role is the best way to maintain your users and securities. So if you have a group of people that are going to work on flow sheets, maybe create a role called Setup, and those people have those roles, and you don't have to go to each individual user to access those securities. So on a user level, when you're in Users and Securities, you would select your user, of course. You would select Features. And then over here, under Features Contains, you can just type in Flow. When you do that, the flow sheet setup and maintain flow sheets appears. You're going to want to give them both of those. Again, that is by user And then if you come into users and securities and select role, pick the applicable role that you want to put these securities on. Go to your features. Again, features contains flow. You'll select both of these, and that's how you do that on the role. So for practice configuration, there's a default that you want to look for. So if you go into Energy, Setup, Practice Admin, Practice Configuration, and then type in the white box, start typing in default. What you're looking for is default range to display. Here it is. If you drop this down, there's a list. You can do all, you can do the last 5 results, you can do the last 10 results, you can do the last 20 results. What you want is you want to be able to select the amount of results that are going to appear just in that box so the provider's not having to scroll. When you're in the flow sheet itself, you can change that to look at more or less results. But as a practice, what do you want to set as the default for all users to see when they go into flow sheets? And provider preferences. To default the flow sheet that they're commonly going to use. We all know that providers don't like clicks. So if the providers, each provider now goes into EHR, preferences, general, and then the patient chart tab, what they're going to find is this section that's called flow sheets. So default flow sheet in the flow sheet tab, maybe you have a pediatric flow sheet that your pediatrician wants to see that pediatric flow sheet every time they go in. Or maybe your adult medicine providers want to see just the adult medicine one. So they can select which flow sheet they want to view when they go into flow sheets. Again, they can select different ones when they're in there, but you don't want it to be blank, forcing them to go up and select a flow sheet. And then the providers have the ability to say, I want to see this many results. Of course, you're going to select it in the practice configuration, but the providers can also change this on their preferences. There's also a user preference. The user preference you can get to in Energy under Options and User Preferences. Okay, under those user preferences, you could also get to user preferences within Practice Admin. Okay, so but under that particular user, under the lab test, under lab test component code type, it actually defaults to the value of lab. But they can change that to show the cross-reference, the LOINC cross-reference code. As I showed you earlier in the presentation, if I'm looking at a lab result on a patient in EHR, it will display that LOINC code for me so I don't have to go look for it. So again, this is on a per user basis how they want that to appear. So let's talk a little bit about building a flow sheet. So we'll talk about building a new one, adding labels to a flow sheet, adding rows, adding elements, adding multiple elements, and moving rows and elements. So when you're building a flow sheet, there's 3 steps in creating a flow sheet. You have to define the flow sheet first. Then you have to add the labels in the rows, which is the clinical data elements to the flow sheets. and then add your medications to the flow sheets if you wish to add medications. So to get to flow sheets, to actually build them, you're going to go into EHR. You're going to go up to the top of EHR, go to Setup, and go to Flow Sheets. Once you get to the flow sheets, your list of flow sheets will appear under Shared. For this particular demonstration, I kept my flow sheet under my personal flow sheets, which will always default first. So if you put any flow sheets under personal, nobody can see them but you. So my recommendation is while you are building or editing a flow sheet, put it in your personal, and then once you are done with it and you have rolled it out, then put it in Shared. So once you get to the flow sheet setup maintenance window, down on the bottom you would click New. This box will appear, and this is actually defining the flow sheet. So is this flow sheet going to live in Shared, or is this flow sheet just going to live in my personal? Again, while I'm building them or editing them, I always keep them in my personal. That way somebody doesn't pick it up and wonder why it's not working until you're actually completed. And then you have the description. You need to name your flow sheet. And then the class. If you remember back a few slides when I showed you what the flow sheet section looked like when it said adult medicine, and then we have diabetic flow sheets. The flow sheets that actually come loaded with the system, and or flow sheets that your center has already created. Those are those classes where the flow sheet would live underneath. So if this one's an adult medicine, it's going to drop underneath that adult medicine. Or I could have picked to put it under endocrinology. Okay? We'll talk about this mark as favorite, but you can mark it as a favorite, which you know when you're actually using something, your favorites always appear on the top. So when I go to my flow sheet, if I want to find another flow sheet besides the one that I'm defaulted on, I want to have a couple of them that are marked as favorites. So when I drop that list down to be able to go and look for another flow sheet, those top ones are my favorite ones, so I can easily select them. Once you've defined your flow sheet, of course, you're going to hit Save. So this sheet here is just explaining to you what I just went through, what the type is, what the description is, the field, the class, and the favorites. I did this PowerPoint this way to add more information for you, so if you have staff that you wanted to hand this PowerPoint to, they could easily follow along and understand what it is that each one of these fields means. So adding a label to a flow sheet. So a label is going to be, for example, vitals, or a label is going to be labs. When you're building a flow sheet, you don't want to just put all your components in there and don't put them in different sections. It gets very confusing for the providers to be able to look at them quickly. It's nice when you actually have them broken out into their own sections. So when you're building your flow sheet, those prerequisites and those components that we went through, you want to make sure that you have those all laid out for you. So you've already gone and gotten all your LOINC codes. You've already gone and figured out what vitals you want to pull in, what problems. And then you can take that on a piece of paper and say, okay, I want my vitals, of course, underneath my vitals. I want my labs under labs. And then this way it's all written out on paper for you, and then it's much easier to build your flow sheet. But when you add a label, you can actually tell the flow sheet where you want that label to sit. So if I want my label on line 1 and then my components will follow, then my next label, when you're doing the label, it's going to drop at the very next line that you have available, or you can tell it where to actually put it. And here's an example. So here's my label. I labeled it vitals, and I said put it on line 1. Here's your drop down that I could say put it on line 11. Once you've added your label, you can go ahead and hit save. There's no rhyme or reason how you create your flow sheet. Some people like to go in and create all their labels. And then underneath each one of those labels, they put their components. Some people add all of their components and then go back in and add the labels after. So there's no right or wrong way of doing it. You don't have to do one before the other. If you add a label and it was incorrect, you can remove it. Let's say I added the label and I put it in the wrong place. I can move it up and down. I added this label and I spelled something wrong. You'll notice there is no edit label. So I would just remove the label and then add another label. Adding new lab elements to a flow sheet. So it's the same concept. We're going to go through this over and over again, all the way through vitals, problems, etc. Whenever you want to add an element, you're going to actually click Add a Row on the flow sheet. Okay, for this particular one, we're adding a new lab element. When you're adding an element, there's going to be a box, which I'm going to show you, that says Add Multiple. You'll figure this out quickly when you're adding multiple labs and you add one and you save it and it kicks you out of the box. Then you got to go back into the box to add another one. So when you're adding multiples, make sure that you click that box, Add Multiples, until you're all done creating your lab elements. Uncheck the box, and then you'll be able to move on. As I mentioned before, remember, flow sheets do not pull test names. They're actually looking for the individual components of that test. So adding an existing lab. So when you go in and you start building your flow sheets, if there's flow sheets already there and or you have built flow sheets in the past, when you come in, I apologize, my screen keeps moving up and down. When you come in, there may be elements already existing. So we're doing labs this time. So I'm looking for my lab, and I see the lab that I want. So what I would do is I would simply check the box or boxes of the labs that I wish to have on my flow sheet. Once you've checked all of the ones that you want checked, you'll go ahead and hit save. You're looking at this and you're like, oh, this is not in any type of order. If you click on the description header, it will put them in alphabetical order. If you click on the component source, it will switch it from lab component to our cross-reference component that we talked about earlier. So let's say our lab component was not there. So I need to add a new one. So when I'm in this lab, I would simply click New. When I click New, I'm going to say, what's the item type? You're not going to change the item type because you're already in the lab tab here in the flow sheet. So it's automatically going to default to what tab you're on. Now in the lab table, you're going to need to select what lab it comes from. Let's say you only use one lab. So you would select LabCorp, or you would select Quest. And then you're going to come down and you're going to find your component. That's where it is extremely helpful to have either that component ID, which we went through in the beginning of the presentation, to be able to quickly find that component that you're looking for. Then you have your row description, that if this says something that people are not accustomed to calling it, you can change this row description. It does not change anything that has to do with those lab results coming in. It's just how is that row going to look when I look at it on the flow sheet. Some row descriptions, especially for labs, are very, very long. So you may want to shorten that so when the clinical staff is looking at those flow sheets, they can quickly tell what it is without having to hover over it to see the entire name. As I mentioned, here's our add multiple. So if I wanted to add another lab, I would simply click my add multiple. It keeps me right in this screen. I can add my next component and keep moving on. When I'm done, I simply uncheck add multiple and click on save. Again, I've given you the descriptions of what the lab table, component, and row description actually means. Adding a new LOIN code element. This is different than just adding our lab component. Now, for that same lab that I was adding, let's say A1C, but my A1C can be done at Quest, LabCorp, and it can be done in-house. So I have that tied to a LOIN code. So it doesn't matter where it comes in from. It's only going to appear once in my flow sheet. So again, I'm in my labs. I don't see it on my list, so I click New. Again, it's going to default to the tab I'm on. But on the lab table this time, instead of picking LabCorp, Quest, or your manual in-house lab, you're going to select LOINC cross-reference. When I mentioned earlier, it's a good idea if you have a patient that has already had this component of that test that you're looking for, or components. If you want to pull some components from a lipid, find a patient that already has it, because the LOIN code will be attached, that you'll be able to quickly find it, come in. When you drop down your component, you will put in that LOIN code that's associated with it. And then again, you have your row description. Maybe they don't want to see this MFR blood. They just want to see that it's an HgA1C. You'll notice here, here's the LOIN code. I selected ID because I knew what the LOIN code was. You can select description, but it gets very confusing sometimes if you do not know. Sometimes there can be multiple components, so you'd have to know exactly which one it is in order to select that LOIN cross-reference code. Adding vitals to a flow sheet. When we're in our flow sheet, again, we're going to add a row. But this time, we're going to go to our vitals tab. I'm going to look here. Again, are the elements that I want here? If so, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select all the ones that I want, and I'm going to hit save. If the element doesn't appear on the list, you're going to click on New. Again, your item type is going to match whatever tab you're in already. And I can select from the list what I would like to display on my flow sheet. Again, if I wanted to add multiple, I would click the add multiple, add all the ones that I want to see, and then click save. Just make sure before you hit save, you uncheck the multiple or it will keep you in that screen. So I didn't have BMI percentile on my flow sheet, so I added it as a new one. When I did that, it brings it into my list. Once I have all of the ones that I want, go ahead and hit save, and it will appear in my flow sheet as a row. Adding medicines to a flow sheet. So medicines are where we went and we looked in the note when the provider is actually documenting or the nurse is documenting on a patient. You can find those medicine codes in the outline of the patient's note. So I would click on Add a Row. Once I'm in the Findings button, the top rows, the description, the ID, and Evaluate Children, if you select those, it will actually put them in order. Okay? Select the ones that you'd like. Go ahead and save. Now, if there wasn't one in there that you were actually looking for, you can add a new one. When you add a new one, it's going to bring you to this page. When I drop down this Medicine ID drop-down box, it's going to put me in this screen. I'm going to actually type in what I'm looking for. Maybe I'm looking for foot exam, or I'm looking for the patient's a smoker. So for this, I typed in that the patient was a smoker. I found my tobacco use, and I clicked OK. We have our row description again, which you can change. Does not change anything in the encounter note or how it will display for the patient in their note. It's just for the flow sheet. And then, of course, we have our cell display. For this particular example, I said positive or negative. So when they're documenting, did they document that the patient does smoke or that the patient does not smoke? Once I've added that, I can go ahead and hit save. There's another thing that you can do as well when you add a medicine ID. You can add a prefix to that medicine ID. If you're not familiar with Encounter Note, all of this is stuff that you can do in the Encounter Note. But you have to be very careful when you start adding prefixes, because if you add a prefix to something and the clinical staff never ever adds a prefix to that particular finding, it will never appear on the flow sheet. So it's finding out what the clinical staff is doing and what they're wanting on that flow sheet and how they document it before you can actually put it on the flow sheet properly. But I wanted to show you the prefix. If you put that prefix there, maybe I wanted it an assessment of. So if this finding was ever in the assessment of the encounter note, it would appear on my flow sheet. Once you add that prefix, you go ahead and click Save. So on the medicines, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Evaluate Children box that I had on there. And then the cell display, which is text, value, status, positive, and negative. I'm going to give you a little tip that if you select the box that says Evaluate Children, it will automatically default the cell display to positive and negative. You can click on that positive and negative all you want. You can't change it. The only way that you will be able to get the cell to change is to unselect Evaluate Children, and then you will be able to select value, status, or text. So here's the Evaluate Children. So if you noticed a few screens back when it said tobacco use, there was a lot of things that were underneath that tobacco use. current smoker, smokeless smoker, all these different things that had to do with tobacco use. If I just selected tobacco use and did not select evaluate children, then the clinical staff would have to select that particular finding in order for it to populate on the flow sheet. If when they're documenting, they select something that's underneath that tobacco use, you're always going to want to say evaluate children. It gives them a broader selection in order for it to appear on the flow sheet. I call those parent findings. So the tobacco use was the parent finding, and then the little pluses underneath are all the children. So if you notice here, I have this checked, and the cell is going to display as positive or negative. So again, when they're documenting, they're hitting the plus or the negative for positive or negative. But here, if I uncheck evaluate children, then my cell display box appears for me to be able to select other things. So on the value, the cell display that's actually called value, you can actually put a range in here. So this one I have the blood glucose that's an in-house finger stick. That's what I want the row to say. And I want to display an actual value on my flow sheet. So I put that it's 0 to 180. This is great, but again, if the clinical staff, when they're documenting, if they're just saying that patient had a positive or a negative blood glucose and they're not putting the value in the actual value prefix down in the bottom of an encounter note, then it will not appear on the flow sheet. As I mentioned before, the positive negative cell display, when I'm documenting as a provider, either in a form or when they're searching in the encounter note, this positive and negative is what it is looking for to display on the flow sheet. And then we have a cell display called text. So let's say they did an ECG and they don't often document that it's positive or negative. They want to know if it's normal or abnormal. So I could say on this cell display text. Again, when the clinical staff is documenting, whether they're picking that ECG from a form or from the search and encounter note, they will have to select the free text box in order for this free text to appear on the flow sheet. And the last cell display is the status. So let's say I had something, and this particular example says fatigue. For a diabetic, I may put fatigue on their flow sheet because if their numbers are consistently high, they're always going to be tired. So I would find my finding, either again on a form or in the search of encounter note. But now down here under this status is where I'm going to have to document in order for it to flow on the flow sheet. So my label on the flow sheet would be fatigue, and next to that it would say worsening. So you can get as creative as you want with these flow sheets, but you really need to, once you create these flow sheets, educate the staff on how these flow sheets work. There's nothing worse than creating this beautiful flow sheet, that if the clinical staff is not documenting properly in order for it to flow into the flow sheet, it's going to frustrate them. So we'll talk about adding a problem to the flow sheet. So you would go in, you would click add a row, and then go to the problems tab. And then when you get to the problems tab, it's going to actually look for the problem diagnosis, your row description, and then this one's a little bit different as to this last one here. It says display problem in flow sheet. You're going to have three selections. When patient has the problem as in an active status, always regarding if the patient has the always regardless of patient's problem list, and then do not display problem on the flow sheet. Once you've done that, you click save, and then you would click on the actual problem or problems that you want. If I added a new one, it's automatically going to be checked. Any other ones that are here that were here prior that were used on another flow sheet, I'd actually have to select them and then hit save. Once I have my problem on the flow sheet, just like any other row that I added, any other label that I added, I can move them up and down, or I can actually highlight it and remove the row. So the 2 slides ago when we said display the problem on the problem list, if the patient has this problem, regardless if they do, but don't show it on the flow sheet, the nice thing about actually adding the problem on the flow sheet, you can actually link that flow sheet to the problem. So whenever the provider is updating their problem list, and let's say they change the status or they put additional comments in it, right from here is going to be the flow sheet button, and they can quickly access the flow sheet right from the problem instead of having to go to the flow sheet tab itself. Special elements. So special elements are clinical elements that actually have a formulary for performing calculations. So a calculation would be a height and a weight equals the BMI. Okay? These are not fields that you can actually add additional fields. Like we did with the medicine codes, we did with the vitals, those other ones that we could actually add new ones. On the special elements, you cannot. You can only select if they've been used on a flow sheet. You could select the ones that are there, or you can click new under the special and then drop the list down, and it is going to give you the list of special elements that exist for you to select from. Again, click add multiple until you've added the ones that you want, and then go ahead and hit save. As you see here on the flow sheet, once I added it, so I see which ones are labels, which ones are actually special elements, which ones are vitals, which ones are findings. So it's nice when you go in and you want to actually edit the flow sheet, you know which tab to actually go into. I added this last cardio element because we do have a center that actually uses heart-centric. This only works if you're using a cardiac management system like heart-centric. But if you are, it is the same concept to add a row, go into the cardio tab, add new. This is another place where you cannot add additional cardio fields. The fields come shipped with the system, and those are the only ones that you can select from. So you would select your test type, so it's a Holter monitor or it's an electrocardiogram. You would select your component, which your components here are already predefined and come with the system. You'll notice I don't have a new to add new components. And then you have your row description, which again, you can change it. Because that row description is only what's appearing here, and how that row description will appear in the flow sheet does not change anything else in your system. Adding medications to the flow sheet. Talked a little bit about this in the beginning. When you add a medication to a flow sheet, you're going to either use the drug code or the drug group. So instead of, if a patient is on 3 different diabetic medications and you want to use this flow sheet across the board for all patients, maybe another diabetic patient is only on 1. So sometimes it's best to actually look at the group. So then it doesn't matter how many one patient is on versus the other patient. It's just going to pull in those particular drugs for that patient. But again, you're going to add a row. In here, it's going to define whether it's a drug code or a drug group. If you have flow sheets already built, some of these drug codes or drug groups may exist. If you have never touched your flow sheets, there won't be anything there. So go ahead and click New. As I mentioned, it's either the only 2 ways to add a medication is by the drug group or by the drug code. So under the drug code, which equals the drug name, you'll drop this down. You'll find your drug, okay, metformin. The very next thing that's going to come up, it says, do you want to evaluate generic equivalents? I would highly suggest you say yes. That way, no matter how that prescription was written, either by a brand name or a generic name, it will pull it on the flow sheet. Once you've added your medication, you'll go ahead and hit save. So adding a medication by a group, when you get to the med type, you'll drop down group. You'll go to the drug group, and again, a list will appear. As I mentioned in the beginning of the training class, it's always best, if you don't know, to go into Energy under the drugs and find out what drug code, what drug group they live under. Much easier to select from in here. And now, congratulations, you've actually created a flow sheet. We're going to go through some more maintaining and actually using the flow sheet. But I wanted to show you, after we had gone through all of those screens, what your flow sheet actually looks like. So we have our different types, so our special, our label, our findings, our labs, and then the description of what it's going to look like, and we have our medications. When I bring that flow sheet up in a patient, this is the name of my flow sheet, these are my labels, and these are either my findings, my vitals, my labs, etc., and then the medications that we added to that flow sheet. So I'm going to take a look real quick to see if we have any questions. What I'm going to do is just unmute everybody just for a minute before we finish to see if anybody has any questions on the first part of our presentation.
I'm now unmuted. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Okay. If nobody has any questions, I will move on to finish the presentation and then open this back up at the end for questions and answers. Okay, utilizing a flow sheet. So we're going to go over viewing sections, show empty rows, grid lines, graphs, viewing a note, viewing a lab, and medications. So viewing, once I'm in the actual flow sheet in EHR, in a patient's chart. In the beginning of the presentation, we talked about what is actually going to default. How many results am I going to see? Or in the provider preferences, how many did they want to see? Well, if I'm in here and I wanted to see more than 10 results, I could actually drop this down and select a different range to view on my flow sheet. So the flow sheet using selection. So here is where I was mentioning when the provider preferences to actually default the flow sheet that they want to see. When they go into flow sheets, it will default to that particular flow sheet. If not, if they don't put anything in there, then I'm going to have to drop this down, either I'll find my favorite ones on the top, or I'll have to look under personal, or I'll have to look under shared. And then when I get under shared, then I have to look for the additional ones. So for the ones that the providers are going to use 90% of the time, please default them. Show empty rows. So this is important for the clinical staff to know, because when I'm looking at a flow sheet, depending on how big that flow sheet is, I may or may not have results for a particular thing that I put on the flow sheet. Maybe the patient doesn't have this done, but every 2 years. Well, I'm only showing the last 10 results, and that's within the last year and a half. So I don't want, as a provider, to see empty rows. So I can, if I keep it checked, I'm showing all rows, whether they're empty or not. If I uncheck it, you'll notice that this finding that was here for heart rate is no longer appearing, because there is no result attached to that line item at this particular time. Show grid lines. This is kind of hard to see on the presentation, but I'm like super old, so it's hard for me to read these. When I'm going across and I'm trying to stay on the same line, you can check this box that says show grid lines. And it's nice, it looks like it's on a little piece of paper that I can directly go right across and be able to easily see them. Some providers like the grid lines, some don't. So that is a preference for them to either check it or keep it unchecked, and then the grid lines will go away. Graphs. So the nice thing is about these flow sheets as well is that you can actually select different components over here on the left-hand side. So let's say we wanted their weight, their blood pressure, their BMI, their A1C, maybe their LDL and HDL. If I checked all of those on the flow sheet and then click graft, this graft appears, which can be printed for the patient. And you can also change the way that this graph appears. If you right-click on it, it's got an entire graph gallery. So some providers just want it super simple, and I just want some dots that have lines on it. Other providers want it that it's very, very clear to the patient that, hey, this is going up and not down. So when they start using it, if they want to change what the graph looks like, when they come in here, just right click on it, and then they have a whole bunch of different selections to use for graphs. When you're in the flow sheet, if you noticed across the top, there's dates. And then underneath those dates are the corresponding things that happen. So if they had an A1C, if they had their vitals done, then they appear underneath that date. Well, the nice thing from the flow sheet as well is I can click on that date and I can see the document that is associated with that particular visit. So again, I don't have to go back out and look underneath the Documents tab to find the note that was associated with those particular lab tests or components that I was viewing on the flow sheet. You can't change it, you can't amend it from there, but you can view the note. Another nice thing here too is that maybe I only put one component on my flow sheet. I only put the LDL. This particular one, I put all of them. But when I actually click on that result, it is going to show me the full requisition that result came in on. So the provider may just be looking at the LDL, but they want to look at what else that patient had done and how those results appeared. So the medications, I mentioned that it's nice to have the medications on there to be able to see the trend. If the patient is doing very, very well, maybe the doctor's just going to keep them on that medication. If the patient is fluctuating in their weight or their A1C or their LDL, they may very well discontinue one medication and start another one to be able to trend to see how that new medication is working. If you hover over these, they'll actually tell you the start date and the end date of the medication. So they can correlate, okay, we ended it on this day, and then we started them on this new medication, and it seems that their vitals or, their blood pressure or maybe their LDL is starting to come down. The other nice thing about having the medications on the flow sheet is if I actually click on the medication itself, I can renew it, discontinue it, or reissue it right from the flow sheet. When I actually click on renew, it's actually going to do the same exact thing that it does if I'm in the medications tab or if I'm in orders and charges and I renew a medication. It's going to renew it and then it's going to discontinue the original. That's the way the system does it no matter where you are when you renew a medication. So now you've built your flow sheets. But the other reason that I had said that the system comes with a set of flow sheets. Sometimes it's better to go and look at those flow sheets to see what's on them. Pull up a patient that you know that is associated with that has diabetes. See if anything appears on the flow sheet. Because you may have to tweak whether it's a different component code. One code should be the same, but maybe they're pulling something different than how your staff, your workflow is actually working with clinical and what they're actually clicking on. But sometimes it's a lot easier to maintain a flow sheet than it is to start from scratch. So in this, we'll talk about editing, removing a row, adding a row, copying a flow sheet, deactivating a flow sheet, activating a flow sheet, show inactive flow sheets, marking it as favorite, unmarking as favorite, and deleting a flow sheet. So you've already built your flow sheet or you have flow sheets that are existing in your system today. What you're going to do is you're going to highlight the flow sheet that you want to edit and simply click edit. It's going to bring you back into the same place we were that showed all the rows, the labels, the medications, and you'll be able to go in and manipulate that flow sheet. When I'm in there, we mentioned this a couple times during the presentation. If I highlight on a row, I can simply highlight on it and click remove. Same thing with the medication list, which appears at the bottom of the flow sheet. If I highlight on either a drug group or a drug name, I can simply highlight it and remove it. Adding a row is just like what we have talked about during the building of your flow sheets. If you have one that you're editing, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to click on add row, and then you're going to either select something else that's within that tab that you're looking for, or you're going to click and add something new. Copying a flow sheet. I'm all about copying, because why do I want to start if I have a diabetic flow sheet out there that's really used for more of my adult patients, and I want one for my pediatric patients? Maybe theirs is a little bit different than an adult diabetic flow sheet. I'm not recreating that whole entire thing. So what you can do is you can actually click on it and copy it. When you copy it, it comes up with the same box that it did when we said to create a new flow sheet. So it's going to pull in, do you want it to be in shared or personal? What's the description of this flow sheet? And what class do you want it under? So I simply just took the preventative adult one, called it preventative child, and now I'm going to put it under the pediatric class. Once you've done that, go ahead and hit save. Again, you can mark it as a favorite, which when the providers do that drop down in the flow sheets, it'll appear right on the top for them to select it. Let's say you have some flow sheets that just don't work. You're never ever going to use them. So you don't want them in the list, because when the providers go to select a different flow sheet than what they have defaulted, that list can get very, very long. So if you're not using a flow sheet at all, just go ahead and click on the flow sheet itself and deactivate it. I always tell people, don't delete them, because it doesn't come up and say, are you sure you want to delete it? Just delete it, and it's gone. Then if I ever want to copy it, or maybe a new provider comes and they're like, okay, I want this type of flow sheet. Okay, let me go get that one and we'll play around with it. So deactivating them just hides them so you can't see them. But if you do deactivate a flow sheet, let's say you deactivated one by mistake, you clicked on the wrong one. All you have to do in the right upper hand corner is click Show Inactive Flow Sheets. You'll highlight the one that you want to activate, and then click on Activate. Here we have where our Show Inactive Flow Sheets was. Underneath it, you also have a Show Detail. When you're working on flow sheets, I like to click on this Show Detail because it opens them all up. If this Show Detail is not selected, I have to open up all these little pluses to find, or whatever one I want. I have to open up that plus. So I just hit this, and then I can select and see all of the ones that I actually have out here. If you'll notice here, we're in shared. So these are only the flow sheets that are in shared. If you drop this down, you can go to personal. Those would be your flow sheets. There's also another one that's for users, and that list is even longer. So depending on where you are, flow sheets 4 will depend on what is going to display here in your flow sheets. Marking a flow sheet as a favorite. I mentioned that a couple times. So when the providers want to go and select a different flow sheet, You want to be able to have 4 or 5 that are favorites that would appear right on the top when they do that drop down in the flow sheets tab. I always tell people, like, marking a medication as a favorite, and then all of a sudden you have 150 favorites. Well, that's not a favorite anymore. So you really want to find out from your docs, other than the one that they have defaulted, that what are the top 5 that you can all agree upon, and we'll mark those as a favorite. If you mark something as a favorite, whether they're using it or not using it anymore, you can actually come back in, click on it, and then when it's already marked as a favorite, the selection down at the bottom will be unmarked favorite. And then the last, which we don't recommend, because flow sheets are not an easy thing to create. So unless you absolutely do not want this, and nobody's ever going to use it, you can delete it. Again, I always suggest to deactivate them. But if you're never ever going to use it and somebody created it and it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't work, and nobody's going to fix it, you can delete it. But if you make a mistake and you click on preventative adult instead of the one you want to delete, it doesn't come up and say, are you sure you want to delete this? It's just gone. So just be careful when you're deleting anything. So I have some tips. They're kind of simple tips, but so the question is, you can add new, additional, special, and cardio elements. No, you can't. Those were the 2 selections in the flow sheet that you could not add additional elements when you did new. Can I delete a flow sheet? You sure can, knowing that it's gone. It's not hidden. You can't call support and then have them get it back for you. Can I inactivate a flow sheet? Yes, you can. Where can I find a flow sheet once I have made it inactive? Always click on the top right to show inactive in order to find those inactive flow sheets. And can I mark it as a favorite? Yes. Another tip that I didn't put on here is, while you're creating your flow sheets, make sure that you have a patient, let's say a diabetic patient, and you know all of those things that you're going to put on that flow sheet. Then open up that patient as you're working on it. Open up that patient, go to the flow sheets tab, and pull up that diabetic flow sheet to make sure you're starting to get values in your flow sheet. Again, you don't want to put that in shared until you're completely done and you know that that flow sheet actually works. So I'm going to open up the lines to see if anybody has any questions.